This is an interview with David Bourne on July 11, 2008 at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, Georgia, about his role in the Smallpox Eradication Project. The interviewer is Alyssa Koski. With this interview, we're hoping to capture for future generations the memories of participants and their families involved in eradicating smallpox. This is an incredibly important and historic achievement, and we want to hear about your experience. I have some questions to guide you, but please feel free to recount any special stories or anecdotes that you remember about events or people. The legal agreement that you signed says that you're donating the oral history to the U.S. federal government, and it will be in the public domain. For the record, could you please state your full name and that you know you're being recorded?
Yes, my name is David Bourne, B-O-U-R-N-E, and I understand this is being recorded.
Thank you so much, and thanks again for being here today.
Good.
Now, David, we just want to start with a brief background about you, how you grew up, your pre-college education and your college education, and how you came to be interested in public health.
You bet. I was raised in New Mexico, and I moved there when I was about 5. My dad was a public health officer for the state of New Mexico for most of his career while I was growing up. So I became interested in public health and medicine generally through him, and I graduated from high school in 1967 from Las Vegas Robertson High School in Las Vegas, New Mexico, and I attended a couple of years at New Mexico Highlands University there in Las Vegas, and then I graduated from the University of Utah in Salt Lake City in 1971. During the course of my last year or so, I applied to the Peace Corps and was accepted approximately a year later. So I was accepted around March of 1972, having graduated in August of 1971. So my interest in general in the Peace Corps was health programs, and they offered me the Smallpox Eradication Program in Ethiopia, and I accepted that and became a volunteer in April 1972 with the intention of coming to Ethiopia and working for the Smallpox Eradication Program.
Okay, so that's a unique way to get involved with CDC's smallpox program.
Right.
So what was your role when you arrived?
I'm sorry?
What was your role in the program when you arrived?
Okay, in the smallpox program, I was what's called a smallpox surveillance officer. So what they did was had us have orientation here for a day or two in Atlanta with Dr. Fahey on smallpox generally. And after orientation, we went to Ethiopia for approximately 8 weeks of language and cultural training. And then we went to our various provinces where we were to work. And I was a smallpox surveillance officer, what they were called. So in Ethiopia, the way it was set up, it was run by jointly by the World Health Organization and the Ethiopian Ministry of Health. And the Peace Corps volunteers worked in concert with people from the Ministry of Health and the WHO to do the eradication. So our job or role was to go village to village and where we were assigned and look for smallpox. When we found it, we would in effect vaccinate the affected village and the surrounding villages. Functionally, I think the goal was a 2-hour walk around the village, but the villages were sufficiently spread out, so it worked out to the affected village and the surrounding villages, the adjacent villages, vaccinate them, and move on to the next area where there are smallpox. I worked in 2 areas of north-central Ethiopia primarily. The first province I worked in was Gojam, and I worked in that province along the western edge of the Blue Nile, and then I transferred. They transferred us out of Gojam, and I went to Wollo, which was essentially on the other side of the Blue Nile. So, and the part I worked in eastern Wollo. So I spent most of my career on each side of the Blue Nile Gorge, and there was an awful lot of smallpox. By that time, 72, into 73, a large part of the remaining smallpox was in the north-central highlands of Ethiopia, and that's where I was. Now, during the course of the year, during the rainy season, which is in the summer, all of us in Wollo, of which there were 4 or 6 volunteers, we would move to the desert because the rains would make we didn't have roads or vehicles, but the paths were impassable due to the mud. So during the summer, we would move to the desert in western Wollo, and that we would deal with a totally different type of people. These were the nomads. They were subject to a sultan, and we would work with them, work with the sultan and his people to find out where the nomads were at that particular time. They always knew where they were, and we would vaccinate them. So that's essentially spent most of my time in the highlands, probably about 9,000 feet elevation. The weather, it was near the equator. The weather was beautiful most of the time. And then in the summertime, I would go to the desert.
Okay. It sounds like, you were quite a young man when you first arrived there, coming out of college and in the Peace Corps. Can you describe to me a little bit what it was like to arrive in such a foreign place and begin to work on such an important program?
It was, to me, very exciting. Initially, certainly, to what I found. I was probably 20. I was 23 when I arrived there, and it was very very new and very exciting. No one spoke English. What we did, we lived in the provincial capital. There's probably 3 or 4 of us in the Peace Corps that had a house together, and we would go to different parts of the provinces of that particular province. So I, for 30 days at a time, would not see any Americans or any white people, for that matter, or anyone who spoke English, with the exception of a translator that I had the first year. And I would fly to in effect, the county seat fly commercially to the county seat of the district I was working. In that particular area, there was very little smallpox. The smallpox was focused in the northern part of that county. So we would walk approximately 50 miles the next day, leaving at dawn and getting there at dark, to get to the center of the northern part of the county where the smallpox was, most of the smallpox was. And for the next 30 days, I would go village to village or to markets trying to find smallpox, which was relatively easy to find. There was a lot of it. So one of the most interesting things, and far and away the most interesting ultimately, was that the second year I didn't have a translator, so I never heard English or spoke English during those entire 30-day segments. And I had a guide but no translator. So that made a very enriching experience, and then it got quite mundane after the initial excitement, month after month, year after year, going village to village, vaccinating. The people were not, they were always very hospitable. They were not always very enthusiastic to see me. They had other diseases that they were worried more about than smallpox, but they were always very hospitable. Even though they were very poor, I lived with the people. There was nowhere else to live. They gave me what food they had. They shared that with me. That was the most incredible thing, and it was very interesting to live in a place where they had not seen white men. Certainly the children never had, and and it was very good. And to deal with, from time to time, the people at WHO in Addis Ababa, Dr. Henderson, came there once in a while. I did meet him once. So it was very exciting. Initially, it became quite mundane and difficult throughout the course of the 2 years and a half.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned that you lived with families while you were staying in these villages.
Right.
Are there any specific memories or stories you can tell me about that experience? That must have been very interesting.
Right. The interesting, there's a tremendous, I understand it, the guys that worked in southern Ethiopia had a different experience than those of us that worked in the north. Even though the people in the north are always very hospitable, as I mentioned, they weren't particularly enthusiastic. But each day you had to, it was assumed that you would be able to spend the night with someone. And it would be only for one night typically, because you would be moving on. And the people would talk to the governor, and the governor would usually have him yourself, but if he wasn't available, occasionally there would be and I could understand everything they could say, even though sometimes they didn't realize it. Sometimes they'd say, "You take him." No, you take him. No, I don't. But it was fun of us to banter with our southern colleagues when people would fight over them. I want him, I want him. And they would kill a sheep for the people in southern Ethiopia quite often. Nobody ever killed a sheep for us. They killed a few chickens, which was always very welcome and very good. But number one, I don't think they had as much up the north, and they were a different, certainly a different tribe, but they were always very friendly. One night I was sleeping outside, even though I was in the company of a family, and because it was very hot. And I remember waking up to a dog barking very close to me, and very scary because the dogs there, they're not exactly pets and all that friendly. So that was one particular case at that point where I was pretty scared to be out there. But in general, they were so friendly, and I felt no danger whatsoever.
Now, you did say that they weren't always enthusiastic about what your purpose was in the village. Oftentimes, maybe because they had other diseases that they were a little bit more worried about. Did you ever run into any problems or difficulties accomplishing what you came to do?
Yes, from time to time, they absolutely would refuse. In general, the way it worked is that the decision makers had smallpox before. So these were the adults, and it was variola minor in Ethiopia, so the mortality rate wasn't very high. So they were often able to survive, and they knew they couldn't get it again. So the people, all the governors, the decision makers, the adults, they were enthusiastic, but they would almost always let their children be vaccinated, but you had to go seek them out, generally speaking. They might come in small groups. I understand many times our colleagues in the South, they would have to have the police control the crowds too, because they wanted to be vaccinated. So that's a little different. But occasionally people would absolutely refuse. No, get out. We don't want you in our village. Leave. And in that case, I would ignore the affected village, but surround or vaccinate the surrounding villages. Thereby, they would be unwittingly protected because, to a large extent, because I would be able to vaccinate those surrounding villages. Now, during the course of our tenure there, the Emperor Haile Selassie was overthrown in a coup by, I assume the people who are still in power today. It was a military junta, and the types of people, at least, that were still in power today. And that created a situation of anarchy to a large extent in the countryside because the government had been overthrown. I think in general the government did not affect the people. They were farmers, kind of under a feudal system, but everyone had a gun in Ethiopia, and there was one situation where right after that revolution in the county seat, in effect, I flew into, some students had surrounded a judge's house who was being transferred, and they were in the spirit of the revolution. They said, no, this judge he expropriated property from the people. He's unjust, and he's not leaving. So the judge hired some robbers, in effect highwaymen that were fairly common there, shifters they call them, and these robbers were well armed, and they came. He hired them to escort him and his family and his stuff, they were planning to go by mule or whatever to the next town, but when these shifters came, these highwaymen came to his house, the students and the people in the town they had a battle, a gun battle. The judge's wife was killed, certainly, and about most of his family, and some of the about half of the highwaymen were killed. This is a gun battle that occurred the day of the evening I was walking back there. So the guy I was staying with was in effect the public health officer, which in effect there was a doctor, and he was treating the wounded, the remaining wounded who were very, very badly wounded, and the people in the house, they threatened to burn down our house, his house, and one I was staying with, because he had done that, but they fortunately didn't do that. But talking about refusal, the next day I was scheduled to go back north, and no one would go with me because the people that got killed were from the northern part of that county, and they were rumored to come down to burn down the town, kind of like the Old West. Then the next day, the judge's family arrived by plane from Addis Ababa, the capital, armed with machine guns and whatnot to exact revenge on the people. And I left on that very plane that it was time for me to go. In fact, that was the last time I was in that part of the country.
Yeah, it seems like that would have been quite a dangerous situation.
It appeared to be, yeah. No, but everybody else really thought so, and I was ready to go, and I was pretty blue. I guess I was 24 by the time, 25. And but I could understand that the guide I usually had, he said, "What good would that do me? And if I got killed up there, I'm from the South, and there was a big feud between the North and the South." So during that whole period, there was a lot of situations like that where the citizens took advantage of the relative anarchy in the country, and soon after that, the Peace Corps offered people to leave voluntarily because of the deteriorating situation, and most of us stayed. I stayed through my tenure and a couple months beyond, but the next year, I think it was probably in '75, they actually kicked the Peace Corps out of Ethiopia, and everybody left.
Okay, how far along into your time with the Peace Corps did this occur? And after it occurred, did that change how you played your role in the smallpox program?
I was pretty well, I was there a total of about 2.5 years, and this was probably about 2 years into it. So I had about 3 months to go, and then so I think if memory serves, it was time to go to the desert anyway, which was totally different. The political situation was, there weren't that much people, there wasn't much government, and the nomads that we dealt with went back and forth between what was called then the territory of Arfaj and Isas and Ethiopia. I think it was Somaliland, or so the political considerations and the security situations were far different in the desert. So I finished out my tenure in the desert, And then I agreed to remain a couple more months to train the new group of smallpox volunteers, about 9 or 12 of them, that came, and I stayed for about 2 months, or 3 months, helping the Ethiopian contractors train this new group.
Now, you mentioned a little bit earlier that you did have some contact with WHO and CDC counterparts, such as Dr. Henderson. Can you tell me a little bit more about that relationship?
I remember meeting him only once, but we had, with regard to CDC, I only met one CDC person. I don't recall his name. He was a EIS officer that came from Atlanta for a period of time, 3 months or so. And he actually worked in a neighboring province, but I did meet him. And so there were very few CDC people in Ethiopia, and there were a few WHO people. Dr. Vitaler was the head of the program there in Ethiopia for WHO. I dealt with a Brazilian epidemiologist, Dr. Ciro de Quadros, and an Indonesian epidemiologist, Dr. Peter Kuswara. There was actually also a Russian epidemiologist I know that came down there. So they had an office there in the capital city in Addis Ababa. I dealt mainly with Dr. Kuswara, to some extent with Dr. de Quadros. So we would occasionally meet with him. Dr. Henry, I would happen to be in Addis Ababa in the office one day. It might have been literally right after I left the troubled area. The plane was going to Addis, so I went there to Addis Ababa, and I may have met him there. I remember the conversation. I was talking to him about the success with those jet guns. The people seemed to like them on the one hand, but on the other hand, they so often broke down, especially in the desert. So, in effect, that turned out, I thought it was a good idea and told him so. He thought that was interesting. But in the end, they didn't work for me very well. But I did have a brief conversation. He wanted to know his status, where I'd come from, that kind of thing in the country. It was an honor to meet him there, because at the time he was the director of the global program. So that was the extent of my dealing with WHO. From time to time, I would go to the office. Not very often. The day-to-day efforts would be just me and a guide, and we're out for 30 days at a time, and then go back to the provincial capital of a town of about 60,000, and we had an office within the Ethiopian Ministry of Health, in effect the health department. So we had a small smallpox office there that, even though there were 4 of us, we were gone so much we rarely saw each other.
Were there any specific challenges or positive aspects to working with the Ministry of Health?
With working with the Ministry of Health? Oh, they were very, actually I don't recall we were any challenges particularly. They were very enthusiastic, very dedicated, and there weren't that many of them either. We probably outnumbered them. They would have, maybe within the whole province, they would probably have a staff of maybe 4, and we would have, there was 4 to 6 of us. So it was pretty equal, and in general, we wouldn't have a lot of interaction with them, because like we did, they would go to different parts of the province. So when we did come together, they were very dedicated, good friends of ours, and so forth. And I had nothing but praise for them and their dedication and their competence.
Great. Now, you mentioned early in the interview that you had about 4 to 6 team members who were also Peace Corps volunteers, but that you didn't see them incredibly often. You were on your own most of the time.
Right.
Were they doing the same sort of thing, and how often did you get to share your experiences together?
They were doing exactly the same thing. Now, this was just in that particular province. I think I think we might have had 4 people there. Throughout the country, there might have been at any one time 20 Peace Corps volunteers in the smallpox program, 25 at different parts of the country. But each of us did exactly the same job. We would go to different provinces, because they were, in our province, Wolo, that would probably, if I remember right, it almost led the nation in number of smallpox cases by that time. And I think the last, they were, I think, among the last cases in Ethiopia after I left were in Wolo province or near there. So we had plenty to do. I would say my area, and other people's might have been similar, but I in effect, I think, was responsible for an area maybe 40 miles wide and 120 miles long, maybe 250,000 people, the way I remember it. But there were no roads, no electricity, no towns. Well, there were some towns, but there were no roads, with the exception of an old road built in the 40s that was impassable, virtually. So I would walk up and down that area for 2 years, and mainly in the north. And my colleagues would do the same. They would go to other areas, and they did a lot of walking as well.
I'd like to talk a little bit about how this whole experience in Ethiopia really influenced your life after, and how it impacted your career in public health.
Great. Right after I came back in around October of 1974, and actually as a result of my conversation with this EIS officer in Ethiopia, he told me about working for CDC, about the process, and that's what I wanted to do. That was the single purpose I had. At the time before I met him, earlier in my career in Ethiopia, I was thinking about coming back and going to pharmacy school, but I decided that no, I would try to work for CDC. So I immediately, probably the next day, I applied to CDC there in October of '74, and I had an interview, and I was hired to start in Los Angeles in January of '75 with the VD program, as everyone in CDC virtually then and maybe today, I'm not sure, I think it may have changed now, but that was the path. You started out as a VD investigator for CDC, and I started out in Los Angeles. So I went from Los Angeles to CDC to Anchorage, Alaska, and to Gallup, New Mexico. So New Mexico happened to be where I'm from. So when the time came to be transferred, I decided I didn't want to be transferred and wanted to remain in New Mexico. So I resigned from CDC after about 8 years, and so the Peace Corps was directly responsible for my remaining in public health and remaining and being at CDC, and I did that for about 8 years, and then for other reasons I didn't remain with CDC. Then from there I worked for the U.S. General Accounting Office for a similar number of years, maybe 10 years, and I currently work with the U.S. Department of Energy. So I've stayed with the federal government from the time I started the Peace Corps in several different agencies, including CDC, and it was directly responsible for my decision and ability to work for CDC.
Okay, thanks. Just in closing, I'd like to ask if there's anything else, any other particularly poignant memories or stories you'd like to share about your time in Ethiopia that we haven't covered so far.
It was basically it was a very hard job. At first it was very exciting. It relatively quickly became hard and mundane, but it was very rewarding, because you could and you would leave a village and know that that area had smallpox for maybe 2,000 years, and they'll never have smallpox again. Now, at the time, I think that feeling, perspective has grown with time, especially when you view the global program in perspective of of disease controls disease control programs that they're seeking now. So it was very, very rewarding. I did have the opportunity also. There was a massive cholera outbreak in the desert during one of the summers there, and that was a situation where far more people were dying and it was far more serious, but we were able to, myself and a colleague, particularly another Peace Corps volunteer, were able to maybe vaccinate several thousand people and even start a couple of IVs, which we'd never done before and haven't done since. But that was rewarding as well. So on balance, it was really quite difficult, but very, very rewarding. And I appreciate the chance to talk about it.
Thank you so much for talking to me about your experience. It sounds like it was very rewarding, had a great impact on your life. We really appreciate you sharing your experiences.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.